Hello, my name is Graham Daniels. I am a psychoanalytic psychotherapist from Northern California. Here to talk to you today about psychoanalysis and sex addiction, two fields that I know something about and have written a book about. A book entitled Getting Real About Sex Addiction, a Psychodynamic Approach to Treatment, written alongside colleague and friend Joe Farley, MFT. I'm also an MFT. In this video, which will be one of several about psychoanalytic approaches to treating sex addiction, notice actually that I'll use terms, a couple of terms interchangeably: psychoanalysis and psychodynamic. Psychodynamic being a term coined in the 1950s to represent a series of theories under the umbrella of psychoanalysis. Its most famous founder is the most famous name in modern psychology, Sigmund Freud. We'll be talking a little bit about him in this video, and talking about a lot of theories as they relate to sex addiction, the field of sex addiction, which I've worked in for close to 20 years, and I've worked in the field of addictions for close to 25 years, getting my start in chemical dependency hospitals in the mid-1990s. I find that a lot of ideas that are talked about in the addictions field are derived from psychoanalytic ideas, and some of them will be relatively obscure to listeners. Others will be actually you may have heard of, or you'll have heard of them in derivative form, and I'll say more about that as we go along. As I said, I've worked in the field of addictions for many, many years. I've been subject to a lot of different rhetoric about addictions, both in professional and social circles, as a polyglot, meaning a multiple languages in our field of psychotherapy and psychology. But I'm going to at times use terms that are from the language of psychoanalysis and sort of define them as they go along. And that, again, I think you'll find that there are a lot of concepts and addictions that are derivative of psychoanalysis, even though psychoanalysis itself doesn't get a lot of credit for being influential in the field. So I'm going to bring up, first of all, the page for the book that I'm going to be referencing in this talk. Here it is. Getting Real About Sex Addiction, a Psychodynamic Approach to Treatment. Graham Daniels, that's me, and Joe Farley. This was published by Rowman and Littlefield, prominent publisher of psychology books, in February of this year. And we'll be doing some live presentations. We have one coming up soon, and perhaps some more later in the year, as well as videos like this to try and promote this. You can just about see some of the small print there. It talks a little bit about how there are related concepts: personality disorder, attachment, developments. The book refers to case illustrations, what we call vignettes, to demonstrate clinical method. And there's a lot of social commentary in the book as well, I think, to whet your appetite if you want to talk about how a treatment of sex addiction intersects, that's a common word used these days, very fashionable, with the social mores of 2022. This book was 3 years in the writing and producing. We're very proud to put it out on the market. Now, I'm going to actually start in a non-psychoanalytic way and talk about where sex addiction is as its status in the field of psychotherapy. The listener may know that there is a body called the American Psychiatric Association, which produces a volume once every decade or so, a volume of diagnostic standards called the DSM. Its latest version, the DSM-5, was produced in 2013, I believe. And prior to that point, there was no particular diagnosis relating to the concepts of sex addiction, which has itself existed, at least as a term, you could argue when it began as a concept, since the 1980s. The most prominent sort of theoretician slash author on the subject has been a man by the name of Dr. Patrick Carnes, who wrote two seminal books in the 80s and early 90s, one called Out of the Shadows, to refer to the shamefacedness of the typical sex addict, and then a book called Don't Call It Love, produced in, I think, in 1991. Anyway, sex addiction itself does not exist as a diagnostic category under the APA. It does sort of exist as a category within the World Health Organization's classification of diagnoses as a compulsive sexual behavior problem, with language like failure to control being a prominent criterion piece of language in its diagnostic terminology. But I'm going to focus just for a moment on the diagnosis that was proposed to the DSM committees roughly a decade ago and ultimately rejected. Now, the category was called hypersexual disorder. And it's interesting because it was rejected. It's not clear why, or at least I won't go into detail as to why. And the proposed disorder featured words like excessive, words like repetitive, words which are commonplace in when talking about the related concept of dependency, as it pertains mostly to the world of substance use disorders. But the language that is most relevant to an analytic understanding of addiction is the language that indicated that behaviors that are under the heading of hypersexual disorder occur in response to stressful events, and that hypersexual behaviors attend to dysphoric mood states, unpleasurable mood states, and that's close to an understanding of what, or starts to touch on the surface of what psychoanalysis has to say. I'm going to stop share, come back to the main screen. Now, what's distinctive about the psychoanalytic approach from, say, the medical model as it has been applied to, say, alcoholism and drug dependence and typical addictions is this idea of a disease, an innate predisposition that a person has. The psychoanalytic model doesn't necessarily disagree with this, but it treats the problem of addiction more or less as a secondary phenomenon. By secondary, I mean as a phenomenon that is similar to the language in the proposed disorder. Addiction is a defense, a symptom, if you like. And a little bit later, I'll read Sigmund Freud's original definition of a symptom. I think you'll be surprised to hear how relevant it still is. A defense against heightened affect or anxiety, those terms being more or less synonymous for our purposes here. I'm going to float just a little vignette, a little pastiche, that is, of a case, anonymous, of course, to give a sense of what the issues are that are going to be talked about in this video and later ones as well. So I'm going to introduce a figure named Andy to the exchange here. Now, Andy is a man who is married, and he identifies as a sex addict. And if asked what that means, he says something along the lines of like he has excessive sex drive. He has too much sex drive. And that he understands his task in, as he calls it, recovery, which is a term associated with 12-step recovery programs, the most famous being that of Alcoholics Anonymous, but there is one pertaining to sex addiction called Sex Addicts Anonymous. He understands his task to be to put his mind on other things, what are called outer circle activities, that which doesn't elicit shame or guilt, which doesn't have to be kept secret, positive activities. And the task of the recovering sex addict is to take your mind off of sex. Now, concurrently, and I said he was a married man, what he reports from his wife is a complaint that is relevant in the treatment. She says to him, when you, meaning he, approaches her for sex, this is her, feel like a piece of meat. And his response, as he has shared, is to say, well, I think it's probably best that I don't initiate sex anymore in my marriage. It's probably best that she take over that particular task from now on. And I'm going to come back to maybe this vignette to sort of talk about how addiction, which in 12-step circles is understood as something that afflicts not only body but mind, and they would even argue spirit, to give it a spiritual dimension. How a person's thinking is sort of pervasively disaffected by addictive. It's not just about a behavior. I think that's an opinion that is, cuts across treatment approaches and philosophies. But what are some of the issues that are stirred by this? Is, you could think of some of them just from the vignette. Is sex addiction about drive or excessive drive? Can one simply take one's mind off of sex? What is the impact of a sex addiction on a significant other, a spouse, for example? What do we notice about the addict's typical thinking or ways of thinking, which I think is important? And to touch upon a basic tenet of psychoanalysis, how much of this is conscious? How much of this is unconscious? So those are some of the thoughts to be thinking about as we're going along here. Now, I am a student of psychoanalysis. I have been for many years, training to be a psychoanalyst. I won't go into in particular what that's all about, but if I was asked to, say, write a paper or write a book, I did write a book, and I referenced many of what I'm about to share in the book, but if I was asked to, say, present, what would you refer to? What might you as the listener want to research to get some of the ideas that are the pedigree of how our profession thinks about something like addiction? There are some pretty famous, as in classic, papers out of the world of psychoanalysis that I would refer you to, that are bedrock, actually, to our understanding not only of psychoanalysis and addiction, but in the bedrock principles in psychotherapy. Papers from, say, even as far back as 1911, Sigmund Freud's 2 Principles of Mental Functioning, and followed by his papers on inhibitions, symptoms, and anxieties. It was in the mid-1920s. Mourning and Melancholia introduced the world of what's called object relations. And here in this context, object means caregiver, our original parents, of course. And so Mourning and Melancholia is the paper in which Freud really introduced the ideas that object loss, our experience of loss, things like abandonment, followed by our tendency to blame ourselves, is part of our psychopathology. And then some of his most famous works in this period that shortly follows World War I as well, Beyond the Pleasure Principle, in which he really consolidated an idea called repetition compulsion, which is perhaps the most important analytic idea related to addiction, and appears in derivative form in a famous way, in a phraseology that has been more or less adopted by the 12-step movement. The concept, as they refer to it, of insanity as being that which a person does over and over again. Insane behavior, as recovering addicts put it, is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. And that actually is a paraphrasing of the idea of repetition compulsion as evolved as an idea through the World War I years by Sigmund Freud and consolidated in this famous paper called Beyond the Pleasure Principle. 2 other notable figures that I'll touch on a little bit in this video. Probably the second most influential person in psychoanalysis is a woman named Melanie Klein, who introduces or really builds upon 2, at least one Freudian concept, splitting, which is very relevant to examining how addicts and even sometimes average people think. And that appears in derivative forms as you hear concepts like compartmentalization and so-called rigid or black and white thinking. I'll explain splitting in a short while in this video. And also something called projective identification, which was picked up by a further famous figure in the object relations psychoanalytic umbrella called Wilfred Bion, a man from the 1950s and 60s. Klein's work, probably her most famous paper on the subject, is Notes on Schizoid Mechanisms, that she published shortly after World War II. And the analytic stance against these writers, which I know I'm talking fast to reference them all, they're not necessarily at odds with the medical construct of the disease of alcoholism, which got consolidated in the mid-1950s by the American Psychiatric Association. But again, the idea in analysis is to not just think about the condition as being something innate and you have a predisposition towards, but to think of it as a defense against something uncomfortable. And that uncomfortable is sometimes very conscious and sometimes deeply unconscious. Now, a little bit of history lesson in psychoanalysis. We could go deep here a little bit. Anxiety and the function of the mind. Freud's idea around the aim of a mind was basically to pursue pleasure and to reduce tension, what he actually called unpleasure. So the two principles, one was about a pleasure principle. We seek to increase pleasure and in particular reduce unpleasure, reduce tension via discharge. Action is discharge. Orgasm is discharge, of course, in the most literal sense. The mental events, thoughts, if you like, are set in motion because of this idea of a tension. We want something, and thought is therefore a wish, most fundamentally a wish. Could be a fantasy, a hallucination, Freud might have called it, a dream. The reality principle, that which he famously sort of culminated his career in saying that leads us to civilization, what he sometimes, what he later called the superego, is that we must learn as human beings to postpone pleasure, and that actually in learning to postpone pleasure, we safeguard pleasure. And this is, leads us to our modern notions of you get a greater reward if you're able to put off pleasure and, have your happy hour at 5 o'clock in the afternoon on a Friday. And there's a reason that it's 5 o'clock, in the afternoon on a Friday, not, 12 noon on a Wednesday or something. It's a reward for having completed the week's work. And that is the message of civilization, basically, at least in the post-industrial world. I know this is getting a bit heady, but this is, sort of the pedigree of our thoughts about what anxiety is. So the average mind experiences anxiety, and anxiety, Freud says, arises out of libido. And it is our libido, anxiety is our libido in conflict with superego, is that mental construct that represents society, represents our conscience, our rules. Ego being a kind of mediator between those two. And the conflict, addictive habits, this is an important idea, are a substitute. They are a symptom. A compromise, one might think. I'll read actually Sigmund Freud's original definition of symptom. This is from his 1926 paper on the subject. Behavior or bodily abnormality caused by the return of the repressed. These are insistent desires. That's an interesting term. Insistent desires, think of addiction, that must be repressed, and they find alternative paths towards satisfaction, addiction therefore being an alternative path, and manifesting as symptoms. A symptom is a sign of, a substitute for an instinctual satisfaction, and is a consequence of repression. And symptoms tend to be activities that are detrimental or useless in one's life. Again, that starts to sound like the problem of destructive habits that are most associated with addiction. That's Sigmund Freud, 1926. But here might stir a question for the average listener. How can sex, say sex addiction, be the substitute for an anxiety that is about sex? Okay, here's a good point. The anxiety that is about sex is actually about forbidden sex and aggression. This, I won't go into detail, but this touches on the famous Oedipal myth in psychoanalysis. And the sex in question is forbidden sex, the most forbidden sex that we can imagine, which is incest and aggression. Aggression as in parasite, actually. So the symptom of a sexual acting out, I'll get to what that term means in just a moment, is a substitute that brings up anxiety, guilt and shame, if you like, or self-blame or self-reproaches, as Freud would have put it, but not as much self-blame or self-reproach as that ultimate forbidden taboo. Hence the idea of taboo, the ultimate forbidden sex. So Freud would probably have thought of sex addictive behaviors like, say, compulsive porn use or compulsive affair seeking or prostitute seeking, all these things as perversions. And that's why he wrote about behaviors like fetishes and masochism as perversions. They were substitutes, symptoms. Okay. So in treatments, what we find is that the patient does a lot of what we call displacing. The patient who has, fears, not consciously of incest per se, but let's say of forbidden, sexuality, displaces their anxiety onto relatively lesser anxieties. So a man who has, for example, fears about taboo fantasies might just talk plainly about masturbation, because it's actually easier to talk about masturbation, even though that too generates unpleasant feeling. Sometimes there is a reversal, which is another psychoanalytic idea, a finding a kind of a reversal of the feeling associated with a behavior. This is the essence of masochism. Masochism is about the transforming of pain into pleasure, or what Freud called reaction formation, where we take the opposite attitude towards something of what we actually feel. So you're disgusted by a behavior, we become very reactive and judgmental about our behavior, and in particular about behavior that appears in others. Think about the intensity, the ferocity of condemnation that people feel towards sex addicts, and particular sexual offenders, because sexual offenders are blending sexuality with aggression in a particular way. Masochism, the transformation of, again, pain into pleasure. That was an idea that I think Dr. Patrick Carnes picked up on in the 1980s, when he thought of sex addicts as those who were using sex rather like a drug, as a mood-altering substance, a mood-altering behavior. And the mood-altering is to take that which is painful, which is uncomfortable, and turn it into pleasure. That's the masochistic impulse. Another example of reaction formation, sort of in reverse, not reversing something into a judgment necessarily, an attraction into a judgment, but turning, say, something that is a judgment into a point of arousal. Think of the man who says of his, of his partner. This can apply to a woman as well, I'm thinking, but the man who says, my wife is disgusted by my behaviors, and he reports that he finds that disgust arousing. That's an example of a reversal, Freud called a reaction formation. The sex addict, as myself and my colleague Joe Farley, as we treat them, they enter treatment with what Freud called the self-reproaches, the self-blame, the guilt and shame, because they have attempted to manage their feelings around their behaviors, and that process has been unsuccessful largely. What has largely been unsuccessful is the attempt to keep it all secret. And this yields what is commonly called compartmentalization. The desire to keep one's forbidden parts of oneself, unwanted parts of oneself, the parts that represent desire, but they're not acceptable to society, separate. This is going to lead to the idea of splitting, which is basically about keeping that which is good and bad separate, because it's so difficult to think of them as being together, integrated within the same mind and feeling whole. So people talk about compartmentalization, which is a derivative concept of this idea of splitting. And a person who splits is also sort of separating action from thought. This has yielded the term acting out, which is interesting. That is more or less adopted by sex addict specialists. And in the sex addiction treatment field, many people within the field of psychotherapy use the term acting out, unaware that it was originally termed by Sigmund Freud in a paper from 1915 and 1914 called Remembering, Repeating, and Working Through. It was a harbinger of the repetition compulsion idea that individuals, patients, do not remember aspects of their life. What they do is repeat. What human doings is repeat, and we repeat through action that which we don't remember. Again, he later codified this into an idea of a compulsion. But a sex addict, basically seeks privacy. And when they enter treatment, it's because the behaviors become so out of control that they've failed basically to keep it private. They have become discovered. And that's more or less a conceptual term in the sex addiction treatment field to represent a common point of entry into treatment. The sex addict has been discovered. It's quite a typical departure from, say, how alcoholics and drug addicts enter treatment, because at least their habits have been known by themselves and all around them for quite some time. It doesn't have that same, the phenomenon of being discovered isn't as typical, I find, for drug addicts and alcoholics. But three aspects, I'm going to talk about with this phenomenon of splitting, this idea that Freud originally coined to indicate something like what Pierre Janet termed in the late 19th century, something to do with dissociating and altered states of consciousness. The Melanie Klein idea was this keeping separate of good and bad. And I don't mean for the moment here in good and bad in moral terms. She meant good, bad in terms of what is frustrating, what is nurturing, so somewhat more encompassing. Keep separate that which is painful and that which is felt as feeling good. They cannot intrude upon each other. So feeling good encompasses the idea of feeling like a good citizen. You have to preserve feeling like a good citizen or a good mother or a good father or a good husband, etc., from the idea that we have a bad self that has forbidden desires. The idea is that these must be kept separate because we have a hard time thinking of them together. And so the addict becomes someone like what Klein and later Wilfred Bion talks about as somebody who ever tries to kind of get rid of bad experiences. And one of the things they do, one of the more abstract concepts in psychoanalysis is this thing called projective identification, which exists in the sex addiction field as the somewhat diluted concept of inducement. The sex addict gets rid of unwanted parts of themselves, and I'm going to argue those are to do with sexuality itself, and particularly aggression. And they tend to induce these feelings, or aggression at least, and anxiety in other people, particularly so-called impacted or betrayed partners. But why do I say that sexuality is an unwanted part of self? Well, I find this true most particularly for, say, porn addicts. It's very common for me to observe in some of the groups that I facilitate of recovering sex addicts that they tend not to feel very sexy as human beings. Part of the voyeuristic pleasure is they're watching sex as it is practiced by other people, not by themselves. They do not feel sexy. Sex is in the other, and that's an important thing to be understood, I think, about an average sex addict. Secondly, the phenomenon of objectification. and that's mostly thought of in terms of the objectification of women, is itself an aspect of unwanted aggression. Often I find that sex addicts are not particularly aware of this, aggression that's within themselves. They are acting upon it. Again, it's being driven into an unconscious aspect. But you hear sex addicts typically say sort of shuffling apologetic statements. A typical one is, I just love women. They tend not to be that much in touch of what people in the psychotherapy field, or those who are arguing, let's say, from a feminist perspective, are saying there's an intrinsic misogyny in that. And in another video, I'll talk about corresponding things that can relate to female sex addiction, and the corresponding concept of misandry, to misogyny, but that's for another time. Back to this idea of splitting and evacuation and getting rid of thoughts. So, the addict, you might think of them, they get rid of bad parts of themselves through their behavior. And that can seem like a paradoxical idea, because aren't they behaving badly? Behavior is, again, a discharge experienced as a sign of getting rid. So they can then go back to their good citizen life, which they try to keep separate. In treatment, we also experience a lot of another area of splitting is so-called rigid or or black and white thinking. That's again a derivative concept. The idea of black and white and rigid thinking is the intolerance basically of uncertainty. There's a psychoanalyst and neuroscientist called Mark Soames who has offered the term recently of felt uncertainty to define affect, negative affect, and I like that definition. Felt uncertainty. The addict doesn't have or cannot tolerate uncertainty. Indeed, to touch on what Wilfred Bion would say, to nuance what Sigmund Freud would say of an addict, which is a pleasure-seeking person, Bion would say something like, the addict is a person who seems to not be able to tolerate, frustration, frustrated desire. And like those who followed Freud, like Klein, Bion would argue as part of the object relations theoretical, world, that the average human being is object-seeking, relationship-seeking. Is really what that concept means. And the essence of the addictive, compulsion from this point of view is to think about the thing that one is addicted to as being a stand-in or a substitute for a relationship, for a kind of objectified relationship to drink, objectified relationship to sex. Again, these ideas that are being used, and they're being used as a stand-in for relationship because there is a felt certainty to these relationships. That which you're addicted to seems ever present. It is ever summonable, and it will, if it could talk, the things that you're addicted to will, keep their promises in the sense that they will do what they say they will do. And, literally, if you're talking about a drug, seconds, minutes, or an hour, depending on the drug and the method of use and so on. You could argue the same would be true of sex and other things that people become addicted to, food, gambling, what have you. In our rigid thinking, and rigid thinking isn't just, pertinent to or, practiced by addicts. It's, unfortunately, we are all capable of being very rigid in our thinking. As human beings, we struggle with dichotomies. We struggle holding good and bad, together so we can feel whole. And to make that sound a little less abstract, I'm talking about the challenge of thinking of, say, an abusive person, somebody who has been abusive, as somebody who can be nurturing. Somebody who has been deceitful, can they also be trustworthy? Think about examples in your life. If somebody has been deceitful to you, how hard is it or how easy it is to then think of them as trustworthy? If somebody has, thinking now of impacted partners, somebody who has been traumatized, victimized, some would say, can they also be, empowered? Can they be strong? as opposed to these simply sounding like contradictions in terms. In the field, if you work in this field as a psychotherapist, you might think of the concepts of medical necessity and personal growth. Can you help people towards personal growth while also obeying some of the standards that the field imposes, like the threshold of medical necessity? But to make this a little bit of a vignette, and to refer back to my earlier vignette, think of Andy again. Andy couldn't think in gray areas. Andy couldn't think in a flexible versus a rigid way. Andy's wife presented to him a problem. I don't like the way you approach me for sex. And Andy's thinking was not, maybe I should rethink my approach to making sexual advances and take into consideration her feelings and what she's saying. Notice that what I introduced, what Andy thinks to do is to get rid of the bad experience, divorce himself, figuratively, from the problem, and just sort of, abrogate. I guess I'll just won't initiate sex anymore, and think it his wife's responsibility. That's an example of what I'm calling splitting, rigid thinking. I don't want to tolerate the uncertainty of not knowing if I'm doing something right. As a result, then this manifests in couples therapy as well. And because in a lot of sex addiction treatment, it's couples, counseling episodes become sort of a front line of early intervention. You notice the splitting phenomenon when somebody who's being told they're being abusive, and there are terms and labels that are used, like perpetrator, that don't help in a way with this. How an addict isn't the only one who would be prone to what I'm about to say. They take this in, and their tendency is to feel all bad, as we say. They're all good or they're all bad. Again, what's termed black and white thinking, the inability to see the gray area. And what they do, this is another psychoanalytic concept, they project that all bad feeling about themselves onto the other. So it becomes the other person is thinking that of me. So then the solution becomes externalized as well. It's a fancy way of saying the task is I must now persuade that other person who is, judging me, criticizing me, telling me I'm abusive, that I'm not abusive. And that tends to become just sort of a very fraught back and forth discussion. And this is why many patients seem to really struggle to tolerate the confrontations, including the confrontations that feel necessary and truthful. And they come from the people who are themselves prone to splitting, people who have been hurt, people who have been betrayed. They have a tendency to think in black and white terms as well. People in the treatment field, professionals, can be prone to using labels and terms. The term addict itself can be used in a way that is pathologizing, and I find sometimes can be problematic. And I'll touch on that more in future videos, in which I'll talk about a concept like projective identification and how it relates to a derivative concept called induced trauma, which is a term you might hear if you're ever anywhere near sex addiction treatment. But that's it for today. At the end of this first video, if you've liked what you hear, stay tuned for others in this series, and possibly hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. Thank you for listening to this recording today.